Hello and welcome once again to the Baselight learning program. In this session I'm going to be covering marks in Baselight. As always, if you've got any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat and I'll answer them at the end of the session. So let me just share my screen and we'll get started. So marks are used in Baselight to mark specific frames in the timeline. They're similar to categories. In fact, they use the same categories as we discussed in the session on categories. But the difference between categories and marks is categories are designed specifically to tag individual shots or strips or grading layers, but they can't be isolated to a single frame. Marks, on the other hand, are intended to mark a specific frame for a certain purpose. For example, there may be a particular bit of dust or something that you want to clear up. There may be something that has to be painted out, or an effect that you need to put in. Maybe a grade changes at a very specific point. So it's very useful to know at what point in a shot or in the timeline something needs to happen. Also, unlike categories, marks can have specific comments attached to them. So I'll show you how we use marks today, how we add them to the timeline, and what we can do with them once we've got them in the timeline. So first of all, adding a mark to the timeline is very simple. You just press L on the keyboard and we get a mark added where the current cursor position is. If I move the cursor, press L again, you can see we add another mark. Now, there's also a button on the blackboard or the slate control panel that does exactly the same thing. If I'm sitting on an existing mark and I press the mark button again, that's L, you can see that the mark disappears, and that's because it's a toggle function. So if I move back to this mark here, you can toggle that one off. And you can quickly jump from one mark to the next using jump to next or previous mark buttons on the blackboard, or if you're working with a keyboard, that would be Shift X and Shift Z to jump between the marks. So you'll notice that as well as having a line in the timeline indicating where the mark is, there's also a little note icon next to it. And if I hover the mouse over that, you'll see a little bit of text pops up. In this case, it says check this frame. And we can actually define the text that we have on each mark. We can have default text, and I'll show you how to set that up in a minute. Or you can make it prompt so you can actually enter text every time you add a mark to the timeline. Now, if you want to remove marks other than toggling them off, you can do it in one of two ways. You can either press and hold the L button on the keyboard, and initially it adds a mark, but if I hold it down, you saw that it got rid of all the marks. Now, adding and taking away marks is covered by undo. So if I do Control Z, that'll undo the deletion of all the marks. So if you accidentally delete the marks, you can bring them back again just using undo. Another way of deleting all the marks in the timeline is to press Command Shift and L, or Control Shift and L if you're working on a Linux system. And again, that's I can bring them back again by pressing Control Z. So you'll notice that in the timeline we've got these marks extend all the way down across all of the layers. I'll explain a little bit more about the different types of marks that we have now. If I hover over one of the marks that's there, you can see it says generic mark. So this is the basic mark that we get if we don't specify any particular mark to add to the timeline. So let's go up to the marks view, and in this view you can see that there's the toggle mark shortcut is L, but we can set the default mark settings here. Now, by default we're adding a timeline mark. In other words, the mark is fixed to the timeline, and you can see that currently it's just that generic mark. But if we wanted to add a different type of mark, let's say we want to actually add a mark to the shot rather than the timeline, and we want the mark specifically to be of the category check the grade at this particular frame. Now, if you remember in the session on categories, I showed you how to set up new categories. if there are categories here that you don't, if there's a category that you need that's not in this list, then you can go in and create a category specifically for a certain type of mark. So now that I've changed it to a shot mark, which will say from the check grade category, we can also decide whether we want to use the default note, which currently is set to check this frame. And if I want to have a different default note, I can click on that and edit it. But in this case, I'm not going to do that. I'm actually just going to say I want it to pop up a prompt to type in a new note. Okay, so now when I press L, it's asking me what I want to say. So we will actually say grade to dark. Now remember that this is something that we're putting at this particular point in the timeline. It's not the same as a category. We're not adding a category called grade to dark. We're putting a mark in. So when I say OK, you can now see that that mark is attached to this shot. It's on the top strip, which means it's attached to the shot, in the same way that categories, shot categories, were always added to the top strip. And you can see the kind of glowing effect around the strip there, showing that this is actually a shot category. If I leave the mouse hovering over it, you get the category popping up, and as before, if I hover the mouse over the note icon, it says grade to dark. So that's adding a shot mark, and if I move along to the next shot, I could add another mark here and say, again, we're putting in the category of I think it was the category was let me just check. Yeah, so check grade. So this would be specifically for checking the grade, so it would be a comment to do with the grade. And notice that as I didn't actually put in a note, there is no note there. Now if I wanted to add a note, I can actually right click on the mark that's already there, and I can say add note text. So I could just say grade to green, maybe. Now there is also a right click menu. If I right click anywhere outside of the marks, then we can add a mark to the timeline, and this will add a timeline mark, just like the original generic mark that we had. So let's say at this point in the timeline, and it adds it where the cursor currently is. So let's put the cursor here, and if I add mark to timeline, and we could use any of the existing categories. So let's say at this point here we just want to check the edit for some reason, and because we've got the setting to open up the prompt for the text, it's going to ask us for that for every time. So I'll put edit should cut here, for example. But let's say we now want to set that as the default text, so it doesn't keep popping up. Okay, so now we've got a timeline mark there, and notice again that the line goes across all of the strips. It doesn't sort of merge into any of the strips. That's because that's a timeline mark. Now alternatively, if I want to manually add a mark to a specific frame in the shot, I can right click on the top strip, and now it gives us the option to add a mark to the shot. So again, let's just say we want to check the framing, let's say at this point. And now because it's put the default text in that I had before, it doesn't really make sense, so maybe that wasn't such a good choice for the default text. But again, I can edit the note text there, and I'll just say check this frame, and I could set that as the default text now. Okay, so again, that's a shot mark, but we also have the ability to add a mark to one of the grading layers. So if we knew there was a problem for some reason in layer 3 at this point in the grade, I can right click on that strip, and now I say add mark to grade, and let's add a check grade mark, and again I'll edit that text, so grade to be checked, and now you can see that mark is associated with layer 3. So they're the three different types of marks that you can add. Timeline marks, which are tied to a specific frame in the timeline, shot marks, which will always be tied to the top strip in a stack, and grade marks, which will be tied to one of the grading layers. And so, for example, if I select all these strips and slide them along the timeline a few frames by just using Alt and the right arrow, notice that the shot and the grade marks are moving with the strips, but those timeline marks, obviously they're fixed to the timeline, so they stay in their positions. And just going back to the marks menu again, we do have the option in there to make the default mark, in other words the mark that's added when you press L or when you press the button on the blackboard. We can also make that a grade mark. Now if I do that, just to show you, and we'll just for now say there's no note. Now if I don't select a specific grading layer, it will be the auto selected layer, which is the one that's outlined in blue. So if at this point I press L, it'll go onto that bottom layer. If I've got a specific layer selected, maybe it's the first grading layer here, and press L now, you can see now it's been added to that top layer. So there's various different ways to add marks to the timeline, to shots, or to layers, either using the mouse or using the default mark or the button on the blackboard. If I just open up the marks menu, you can see here is the delete all marks option, a keyboard shortcut for that, Shift and Command or Control L, as I already showed you. You also have the options to delete all the marks of a specific category, so it'll offer us not all of the categories, but all of the categories that have marks in the timeline. So if I wanted to get rid of, maybe there's no problem with any of the grades, so I can choose to just delete all of the check grade category marks, and so all those orange marks have now gone, whether they're timeline marks, shot marks, or grade marks. If I just bring them back again. And we can also choose to delete all the default marks. Now at the moment the default mark is check grade, so that would do the same thing. So let's just change the default mark back to the generic timeline mark. Now if I do delete all default marks, the ones that were added initially when I first started doing this have all gone. Now the reason for being able to delete default marks is sometimes unless you select a specific category for mark, you end up adding marks just simply as locators in the timeline. And if you want to clean up the timeline because you don't need those marks anymore, that's a quick way to do it, is just delete all the default marks. And then if I just bring those back. And then the last option there is delete selected strip marks. So if I select a specific strip and delete selected strip marks, it'll only delete the marks on that strip. So rather than deleting them by category, it's just going to remove all the marks from a specific strip. Now obviously I've got an awful lot of marks in the timeline there, more than you would normally probably have in a typical timeline. So let me show you how, in case you do end up with more marks than you really want to see, let me show you how you can actually filter the marks that you're seeing in the timeline. And for that we've got another view in Baselight. It's called the Marks and Client Events view. And if I open that view up here, you can see it's giving us a list of, well, currently it's showing us all of the marks that we've got in the timeline. So currently we've got 9 marked frames, and this is a list of them. And there's a little key here which tells us whether it's a shot mark, a timeline mark, or a grade mark. And we can, first of all, we can choose to only see the marks that are on shots by turning off these other categories. So that's now just showing us the marks that are on the shots. Alternatively, we could leave these all on, and we could choose to just filter by category. So we can turn them all off. The marks are all still there, but we're not actually seeing any of them at the moment. And if we now only want to see the marks for checking the grade, we can turn on just that category. And that's possibly a more useful way while you're working in Baselight of filtering the marks. If somebody's used a specific category to annotate a particular issue, then rather than cluttering up your timeline with a lot of marks that you don't need to see, you can turn them all off and then just turn on the ones that you do want to see. Now, not only does this affect the marks that you actually see in the timeline, but if I just move that window over, of course, it'll affect the marks that the cursor will jump to, because it'll only jump to marks that are visible in the timeline. So if I use Shift and Z now, it's only going to jump between those specific marks, which is a very useful feature. Now in this view we can also edit the marks, so let me just bring them all back. So let's say, for example, well, first of all, we can choose to jump to a specific mark. If I move the cursor to this mark here, sorry, if I jump the cursor to this mark here, we can say follow cursor, and that will automatically follow whichever mark the cursor is sitting on. And let's say that this mark here we actually want to change. The note. So actually, it wasn't too green; it was too cyan. That'll now update the mark in the timeline. So if I make a change to that note now. Anyway, we can also, as well as editing marks, editing the notes, we can change the category. So we could change that to for approval. So now you can see it's actually a different color. And we can delete marks here as well, individually delete marks using the delete button there. Just undo that. And finally, we can create new marks from here. So rather than having to set up a default mark, as you've seen, we can right click and then right click in a certain point in the timeline, and we can choose the category of mark to add. Alternatively, we can do it in this view here. By choosing which type of mark we want to add here. So let's say we want to add a timeline mark here, and we want to add it let's say at this point here we want to check the framing, and we can click on the plus button there. Now obviously there's no note set by default, so there's no note on this mark I've added, but I can now add frame off center. So there we go, there's a mark there. Now you'll notice there's a fourth category in the marks and client events view, and that is the client events. Now if you're working with the Baselight client view, which is enabled from this button here, and we're not going to cover that in this session, but that'll be in a separate session. The client view has the option for the client to be able to type in notes and also see responses to those notes. And they enter the Baselight timeline as client events. So if the client were to add a note at a specific point in the timeline, it will appear here as a client event mark in this list. But we can also create client event marks by choosing the category here. And now they're slightly different from normal marks because they can be applied to the whole shot, more like a category. But in this case, I want to mark a specific frame, and I'm just going to say this frame here, shot to dark. And you'll notice that has a different symbol in the timeline. That's got a little C indicating that it's a client note. Now, this was actually created by me rather than the client in the client viewer. And you can see that the user that created that, because it was me, it says Baselight. Now, if the client had created that from their client viewer, the user that they had logged in as, their name would appear in this list here. So it's a way of creating an embedded chat. So you've got an entire dialogue. Let's say made it lighter. And so now at this particular point in the stack, you can see we now have a conversation going on. So you'll see the entire chat back and forth attached to that specific mark in the timeline. And of course that's saved with the scene. So if you're using the client view, this is a very powerful way of keeping a history of any dialogue that goes on between the colorist and the client. Under this drop down here, we've got the option to delete frame client events and mark at this particular point here, but if we do that we lose the entire chat history. So we won't do that, but that is an option there if you do want to basically delete that chat from the client mark. As with the other marks, if we don't want to see them, we can turn off just using the filtering at the top here, so we don't have to see the client marks in the timeline if we don't need them. One thing I didn't show you before is that we can have multiple marks on the same frame. So for example, where the cursor is currently sitting, we've got that client mark, but we could also add, say, a mark to layer 2, a grade mark. So if I right click on that and say add mark to grade, and we'll set that to the check grade category. If I just move the cursor to one side, you'll see that both those different mark categories are shown as a kind of striped mark in the timeline, and if I hover over that and right click, I can add a note text to that mark that I just added, tricky lighting or something like that. And so now we have on the same frame in the timeline, we've got both the mark that I added in the check grade category and also the client mark. So I'll just undo that. Okay, if I just show you a couple more things you can do with the right click menu, if we have the option here to display all note text, and that'll simply just, without having to click on any of the note icons, it'll just show us the text all the time. I tend to find this gets a bit cluttered, so that's the default for that is off, and I tend to leave that off. Okay, so what else can we do with marks? Obviously they're a very powerful way of annotating the timeline as you're working. Well, we can export the marks. Now if you're using Baselight Look, the free training version of Baselight, then if you export a report, and if I go to the report view here, it's possible to include marks as part of the report. If I scroll down here, there's a button here. Let me just make that a little bit bigger so you can see it more clearly. There's a button here which allows you to turn on and off the exporting of marks, and if I turn it on, we can then choose which mark categories we want to export. So let's turn all the ones that I've used, turn them on for now. And because the report is updated live, I don't actually need to export the report. I can just view it in the preview window. If I move on to the page here, you can see those shots there. They're the first two shots, and they're the ones that have got these marks on. Now, it doesn't show you the timeline marks. It only shows you the shot marks because this is a shot report. If you're running the full version of Baselight, which I am running here, in the shots view, under the actions menu here, we have the option to export mark and shot data. That's not available in Baselight Look, but if I click on that button there, you'll see that we have basically this allows us to save all sorts of data about each shot in CSV format, and we can choose to export marks, including the category, any notes that they have, and also whether or not to include their source timecode. It'll always include the timeline timecode, but it'll also show you the source timecode if you choose here. So that's a very powerful feature. It allows you in simple CSV format to extract all of the comments, all of those marks from the timeline, and then use them in other points in your workflow. Okay, so another use of marks is to specify a frame range when you're rendering from the timeline. So if I just open the render view, now at the moment it's set to render all the frames in the timeline, but if I click on this button here, we now have the option to render selected frames. So if I click on this drop down and choose, well, we can choose either timeline marked frames or strip marked frames. Now for rendering a frame range you would normally put marks on the timeline, so I'll choose timeline marked frames, and for now let's just choose the generic marks that I added. Obviously if you're going to use this workflow then you would use a specific mark category to decide the frame range that you want to render. I'm just going to use the generic marks that I added earlier. So if I enable that and then say select marks with these categories, of course you could choose more than one category if you wanted. You can now see that it's actually selected 3 frames. They're the frames where we have those generic marks. Now, if I just go ahead and render now, I'll end up with just 3 single frame renders. So we need to tell it we want to actually render a range between those marks. And let's just say in this case we want to render between these 2 marks here. So I'll just manually remove the first one from delete, just simply deleting it, and then I'll put a dash in between the 2, and that specifies a range of frames. So that'll now render from frame 125, which is where this mark here is, to frame 209. So you can see that's now the range of frames that will render. Now alternatively, if you just wanted to have a single frame rendered for each of the marks you put on the timeline, and they don't need to be timeline marks, of course they could be marks you put on specific grades. So if there was an issue with a grade on a certain layer, you could choose that category and you would select, let's just do that now, so timeline marked frames, sorry, strip marked frames, check grade, and select marks with those categories. So that will now render those 3 frames, so that's these ones here. And in that case, I obviously wouldn't want to render them to a movie. I'd render them to some sort of sequence, maybe a JPEG or an EXR file. So that's how you can use marks to define a frame range or to render individual frames from the timeline. So basically what I've been doing so far is just manually adding marks to the timeline to use them for annotation and as a way of getting information from Baselight into the rest of the workflow. Marks can also be added to the timeline either by operations that happen in Baselight. For example, if you run the scene detect, then marks may be added in the timeline where the scene detect doesn't think that there was a big enough change to qualify as a cut, but it reaches a threshold where it thinks it might be a cut, so it'll actually add a mark to the timeline, and those are added as special marks called scene detect marks. Similarly, if you use the audio syncing tools in Baselight, it'll sometimes add marks to the timeline to show you where syncing has happened between the picture and the sound. The timeline sort operation has the option to add marks to the timeline which will indicate the original conform range. So if shots are extended, you'll see the part that was originally conformed as well as the handles that have been added as part of the timeline sort. And marks can also come into Baselight from an external source. For example, if you conform an AAF from Avid, which contains marks from the Avid timeline, and Avid allows you to specify up to 8 different mark categories, you have the option of bringing those into Baselight and having them appear on your timeline as marks. So as an example, let me show you an AAF import that includes marks. So if I go to another scene, currently this is empty, so I'll just go to the conform window, and I've got an AAF that I created in Avid earlier, just a simple AAF, but I've put a few marks with comments in the Avid sequence. And let me just load up the settings that I used to conform it. And there's an option at the bottom here, because when Baselight had a look at the AAF when I first loaded it and discovered there were marks in there, it's now giving me the option to apply marks in the timeline as part of the conform process. So if I choose yes, then I can choose how to assign those, effectively how to map those Avid marks into the categories that we have in Baselight. So if I click on this button here, as I said, Avid gives you 8 different marks. They're just different colors, and in Baselight by default we can just simply use the same Avid mark colors, or we can map any one of those marks. Let's say we'd used red marks in our Avid timeline at points where the editor wanted to definitely check that we could do something in the grade. So at that point there we could actually map them to check grade. And now when I do the conform, so it's found all the media. If I complete the conform and close the window. All being well, yep, there we go. So it's brought in the marks that I added in the timeline in Avid, and if I hover the mouse over that, that one says middle C. Can't remember what that was now. Oh yes, he was obviously adjusting a note. Probably wasn't middle C. And the next one here was open the lid. So yes, not really the lid, but yes. So anyway, they were comments that I put on the marks in the Avid timeline. So you can see that this process allows you to bring those marks into Baselight from the Avid. And then of course they then become part of your timeline and will follow through the rest of the workflow as I've already shown you. So there were a few questions that came in on the chat during that session. The first one was, is there a way to move timeline marks? No, not currently. Once you've added a mark to the timeline, or the shot or a grade, it's fixed where you position it. It's possible we could change that. I'll have a chat with the developers and see what they say. The next question was, is there a shortcut to move clips or layers to a timeline mark? I guess the idea there would be you'd put a mark in the timeline and then you would use that to synchronize or move a clip to that specific time. Again, not something we currently do, but it's not a bad suggestion. And in fact, in version 6, we'll be adding audio to the timeline, and we could look at having marks in audio and video clips and then lining them up as a way to synchronize audio to video. Can we use Marks and Clients View on Baselight Look? Yes, the Marks and Clients View is available in Baselight Look, and that ability to reply to client comments in that view is also supported on Baselight Look. Is it possible for us to copy mark comments into the clips metadata or comments in Shots View, like you can with categories? Not currently. The issue there is that the metadata on a clip or a shot is obviously shot based, so there's only one comment for the shot, whereas marks are frame based, so you may have several marks of the same category all within the same shot, so you'd have to have some way of deciding which one of those individual comments you would want to apply. So it's not something that we currently do, but there may be a way to do it. So again, I'll have a chat with the developers and see what they suggest. And that was all the comments. One thing I didn't point out is I showed you how you could bring in marks from an Avid AAF. It's also possible to bring in marks from a CMX EDL. Both timeline and shot marks can be imported, but they need to be formatted in the EDL in the correct way in order for Baselight to recognize them. Anyway, thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed that session, and I will see you next time. Bye.